Meet Florida attorney Abbigail Webb.
Fiduciary duty to me means that I have to put my client's interest above my own. In every action that I take in representing a client, I think of them first, what's best for them.
And meet emergency medicine physician Leah Houston.
You have this fiduciary responsibility to your patient, but you also have a boss who you're wanting to make happy so you don't get fired. So you meet the metrics, so you hit those RVUs. And it's impossible to serve both, in my opinion, in this current system.
Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. This is Patty Fay. In a departure from the norm, I've got a couple of guests on the podcast today. Dr. Leah Houston is an emergency medicine physician, and Ms. Abbigail Webb is an attorney. A very specific tweet, a post on Twitter, caught my eye and led me to reach out to Leah and Abbigail. So we'll get to that in a minute. Dr. Houston is an emergency medicine physician and entrepreneur who's the founder of HPEC and EverCred, two companies geared toward creating physician independence from the corporate overlords of healthcare. She wants to create security for the online identities of physicians and make physicians the owners and controllers of their credentials and other digital assets. And Dr. Houston has even bigger plans, which we'll talk about. And she very much equates her efforts with the goal of transforming medicine to a physician-led profession, independent of the financial interests and corruption of large healthcare entities. So we'll get to all those details in a bit, but first I wanted to ask Leah and Abbigail to give us a little better idea of who they are. And Leah, maybe we can start with you. Can you give us a little thumbnail sketch?
Well, you did a pretty great job of that, so I appreciate that beautiful introduction. Yeah, like a lot of physicians that are out there, I was practicing and I was super frustrated. I really didn't feel like I had the freedom and autonomy that I thought I would feel as a doctor. And so shortly after working, I noticed that a hospital had been using my identity to bill for patients that I never saw. A hospital I no longer worked in a state I no longer was licensed in.
Wow.
And, that event really opened my eyes to how bad things were. And that's what led me to start HPEC.
Excellent. And Abbigail, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a Florida barred attorney. I've been practicing for about 11 years now. I am general counsel for a medium-sized organization that's in a few states on the Atlantic coast. And I support Dr. Houston in her endeavors, and that's why I'm here.
Super. I know you mentioned to me that you're an advocate for what she's working on. And that brings me to that tweet that caught my eye. And I pulled it up again. And what Leah had tweeted is that Abbigail Webb, quote, is an attorney. I shared with her what's going on in medicine, the corporate practice of medicine, the racketeering around board exams, the prior authorizations, the certificate of need laws, the scope creep. Her reply, she said, that is all illegal in the practice of law, close quote. So I'm wondering, Abbigail, how are you thinking about the differences between law and medicine?
I think what I'm particularly concerned about is what Leah has shared with me about who governs the practice of medicine and the fact that it's slowly becoming less and less actual medical doctors that are governing the practice. And we compared that to the practice of law. And specifically, I can speak for the state of Florida, where I'm barred. And it's so different. And that's what began this conversation.
Huh. And how do you see the difference? What do you notice?
As far as Florida is concerned, the highest body that regulates the Florida bar is the Florida Supreme Court. And that has 7 members, and there are no non-lawyers allowed to be in that body. So that's our very top organization. And then after the Florida Supreme Court is the Florida Bar of Governors. And that has 52 members, and only 2 of them are allowed to be non-lawyers. Mm-hmm. And for those 2 people, they have term limits. And so the majority of all of our laws all of our regulations, the regulation of the practice of law in Florida is really done by lawyers and members of the community that know what's best for the clients.
Well, I think that the thing that we were talking about primarily in that tweet was more the corporate practice of medicine and the fact that only lawyers can own law firms. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And
the reason for that, the underlying reason for that is ethical issues, right? They do not want non-lawyers making decisions for clients. For example, if you had a non-lawyer owning a law firm, they could potentially force a decision on a client that was unethical. And so the idea behind only having lawyers own law firms is to keep everything ethical. And I think that really could be seen in medicine, where you have these non-doctors making decisions and forcing the doctors to make unethical decisions because they don't have enough resources or they don't have what they need for their patients.
Yeah, I think this is just a direct hit, Abbigail, to what I've been railing against, which is the corporate practice of medicine and the way it has been just circumvented, I think very systematically circumvented across the United States. So there have been these laws on the books, and I know there's the corporate practice of law as well and some of the other professions, but probably it's the most robust, at least originally in law and medicine, I would think. It's just been absolutely dismantled. You can see all these for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals and healthcare systems across the country with non-physician CEOs. Any insight into the dangers of that, or even any insights into how this might have happened?
You know, a lot of people aren't aware that non-lawyers can't own law firms. And that's one of the reasons why you will never see a law firm as a publicly traded company, because you can't just have random individuals owning it. But you take a look at medical practices and hospitals, and those are publicly traded companies. A lot of times the shareholders have no connection sometimes with medicine. They're not medical doctors. And you're going to see a big difference in how that entity is run.
Yeah, like HCA and Cigna and Centene. There are a bunch of publicly traded, very, very profitable healthcare systems. Do you have any insight into what it would look like on the state level, how these statutes would have gotten dismantled and so much permission given for non-physicians to move in and be leading all these organizations?
I think that we as physicians have really yielded to the authorities. Our profession in general, you know, we are here to serve our patients. We took a Hippocratic oath to serve our patients. So when people come in and claim that they're going to take some of this administrative work off of our back and like make things easy for us and just trust us, everything's going to be okay, we want to believe them because it's a lot of work. And there was a lot of physicians when these rules were being put in place who were very concerned. You know, the corporate practice of medicine is allowed in the state of Florida, where I don't think the corporate practice of law is allowed anywhere. I don't know. Is that right? Abigail, do you know?
To my understanding, throughout the United States, non-lawyers cannot own law firms. I only know that for certain in Florida, but it's my understanding that it's the same way in every state. And that's why you just don't see publicly traded law firms. And I can't imagine, like, lawyers have a lot of the same duties. We have a fiduciary duty to our clients, and I can't have a non-lawyer telling me how to spend money, telling me how to make decisions, because I have to be the one to make the decision or to help the client with the decision. And so doctors are put routinely in this horrible position where they're trying to fulfill their Hippocratic oath and they don't have the resources to do it.
Could you talk more about the fiduciary responsibility? Because I think that is the crux of it. You know, physicians have a fiduciary responsibility to their patients to put their patients' needs above their own and have an ethical obligation to do the right thing on behalf of their patients. And yet the physicians are being directed by people who are answering to shareholders. What would it look like in law if a lawyer was clearly beholden to somebody other than their clients?
I think it's going to be really hard to turn the Titanic around. And I know Dr. Houston will get to that later on her ideas for how to do that. How it got away from you guys, I think, is that the decision makers started to change, and the decision makers started to be corporations and not physicians.
Or influenced by corporations. There's a malaligned incentive problem. People sitting on the boards of state medical boards and specialty boards who are getting big fat checks from corporate interests, and they're serving those corporations rather than the needs of their fellow colleagues, which is what the purpose of those roles were. In the practice of medicine, we have a scope of practice problem where there's non-physicians practicing essentially medicine, and you guys don't have that in the practice of law. Is that correct?
That is correct. The Florida Bar or the state bar associations regulate that, and there are clear rules that make sure that non-attorneys cannot do certain things. They cannot represent a person in court. They cannot sign for a person. They cannot accept, for example, a settlement on behalf of someone. And there have been groups, for example, in Florida, there was a group of paralegals that tried to get an official paralegal certificate in Florida. But, when they got right down to it, the Florida bar was uncomfortable with that because it came too close to the practice of law. And they really guard the sanctity of the practice of law to make sure that the clients are protected at the end of the day.
Can you compare the educational background of a paralegal versus an attorney?
I think generally a paralegal has probably a bachelor's degree and some experience working at a law firm. And then your attorney generally has a 4-year bachelor's degree plus a 3-year law degree, plus has taken a state bar exam.
Right.
And in contrast, the non-physician providers often don't even have a 4-year degree. You can have an associate's degree at times, and they often can do an online training to gain a nurse practitioner degree, for example. Physician's assistants do have a 4-year degree and 2 years of additional medical training, which is a little more robust, in my opinion and experience. But then they're given all these so-called privileges, like prescriber privileges, which when you kind of add all these things up, it's the practice of medicine.
I had Nuran El-Ajba on the podcast, and we talked about her book, which really specifically looked at the NPs and PAs and the scope creep that you're talking about, and some dire outcomes that had happened as a result of really these folks with dramatically less education than physicians putting themselves or being thrust into situations where they're way over their head. And there's really no comparison between the credentials between somebody with an MD or DO versus NP or PA.
Patty, that reminds me that as a consumer of medical services, it's sometimes really unclear to me what my provider's credentials are. So many people are calling themselves doctor when they're not a medical licensed doctor. I'm sure if it's unclear for me, it's unclear for many others. If you contrast that with the practice of law, you cannot use ESQ, you cannot call yourself attorney at law, you cannot use the word lawyer. All of these words are absolutely forbidden and off limits, and the Florida bar will come after you, or the state bar will come after you if you are practicing law without a license.
Right. Yeah, I think the gray area that's been stepped into or leapt into is the use of the word doctor, which is legitimate use by somebody with an advanced degree. But I think it's disconcerting what those advanced degrees look like in many cases. Like Leah was saying, very little clinical time. It's possible to have a real paucity of clinical experience and end up with the ability to call yourself a doctor, nurse practitioner. I think the scope creep is a significant issue, and it is really a concern for patients. I appreciate your comment, Abbigail. As a consumer of healthcare who is taking care of me or who is taking care of my child, before we leap in to discussions with Leah about her companies, I would like to return to the idea of the fiduciary responsibility, Abbigail. And it feels to me like that is something that ought to have some teeth. I mean, we've got these corporate practice of medicine statutes, which have been circumvented. And we've got what I've heard called friendly captives, where there's a physician who's friendly to the administration or to the private equity company, and they structure things so that it appears to be physician-led. But we do have a fiduciary responsibility. And isn't there some substance to that?
I think there is. I think that the medical community might, if a good plaintiff's lawyer was interested in this, there might be some issues. Fiduciary duty to me means that I have to put my client's interest above my own. in every action that I take in representing a client, I think of them first and what's best for them. And with some of these healthcare systems that are set up for profit, they're making it almost impossible for doctors to complete their own fiduciary duties to the patient.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I don't necessarily think it's for-profit versus nonprofit. I think it's the employment-based model when you're being employed by somebody who isn't a colleague in non-physician-owned hospitals, non-physician-owned practices, like all of these larger vertically integrated systems that you mentioned previously. They're essentially employing the physician community. There's more than 70% of doctors are now employed. And, now you have this fiduciary responsibility to your patient, but you also have a boss who you're also wanting to make happy so you don't get fired, so you meet the metrics, so you hit those RVUs. And it's impossible to serve both, in my opinion, in this current system. And I think this is where the moral injury and the burnout is coming from, that feeling torn between those two responsibilities.
The key difference here is that a lawyer in a law firm, that lawyer's boss also has the fiduciary duty. So those lawyers can speak to each other and talk about the duty, right? But the doctor's boss doesn't necessarily have the same duties. And that's a real conflict of interest. And then the doctor has to explain to their boss, no, I need to do this to fulfill my Hippocratic oath or to fulfill my fiduciary duty. And the boss might not understand that in the same way.
They might be dubbed a disruptive physician as a result of surfacing these complaints. And I agree with Leah 100%. This is the very source of moral injury, which is an inability to fulfill the obligations that you strongly have and deeply feel to delivering high quality care, taking excellent care of the patients, and really no ability to do that with 20-minute appointments or whatever the limitations are, whatever the corporatized medicine looks like in the various practices.
Patty, when you said 20-minute appointments, I just thought about that. And I'm like, there's no way I could ever cap a client's time. I mean, I could say, okay, I'm going to set aside an hour for you. But if it turned out that I needed to spend more than an hour with them, I would have to do that. I would have to either schedule them to come back or just stay later or whatever I needed to do. You can't do that. You don't know what the person's issue is, right?
Right.
Along with that, what happened is a lot of these corporate interests, they learned how to play tricks. They learned how to play games with the system that essentially created these problems. So for example, okay, the 15, 20-minute appointment, if you have to reschedule another appointment, we get to bill you for another appointment.
Right.
OBGYN visit that includes a pap smear, you get paid more for that visit than if you have a pap smear within a family practice visit with your entire physical. There's just all of these malaligned incentives and improperly priced structures being counted at the top, looked at them, and then built systems of incentivization to line their pockets rather than to serve patients. And doctors and patients are now trapped in those systems. They need to get out.
It's interesting that you say that. Now that I compare that with the practice of law, lawyers have complete control over the amount that they're charging, right? And doctors have lost a lot of their control over the pricing. And so we get to charge by the minute. And if we take more minutes, we get to charge more because that's fair. And we have alternative fee arrangements, of course. But for the most part, lawyers either charge a contingency fee if they win, or they charge by the hour or by the portion of the hour.
Right. And a lot of physicians are coming out of medical school with more than $250,000 debt, and they come out and they become salaried. Then they get on the fast track and don't even have time to think. They can't even really engage the prefrontal cortex around what issues the patient has.
Doctors have non-competes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So lawyers do not have non-competes.
And why?
Because it's about client protection. A client should have the right to choose any lawyer that they want to choose. So if you had non-competes in place, that would limit the client's right to choose whatever lawyer they want. Now, I mean, in my personal opinion, I think that should work the same way with doctors. You would think that a patient should have the right to go to whatever doctor that they want to go to. And if their doctor leaves a certain hospital, they should be able to follow that doctor. But I guess it just doesn't work the same way in the medical profession. And it's shocking to me.
That's a great point.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so Doctors, they have non-competes. Lawyers aren't allowed to have that. Doctors also aren't allowed to own hospitals according to the ACA. And the exact opposite is true for law firms. Non-physicians can practice medicine, and that's definitely not allowed for attorneys. So 3 big things. I think there's probably many more. And like you said, I don't know how we got here.
Systematic dismantling of the corporate practice of medicine statutes was probably a huge lobbying effort. A lot of dollars associated with taking over these healthcare systems. Even private equity firms would find the low-hanging fruit and buy pieces of the healthcare system and streamline them, in quotes, streamline. Got to run it like a business. I think that's a big problem. It's a lot of greed associated with running it like a business. One thing, Abbigail, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about the friendly captive, whether it's a tax-exempt organization or a for-profit system or a private equity setup. Any thoughts about how the corporate practice of medicine has been corrupted there, or how people have been lassoed into serving as the friendly captives, the physician who's at the head of a group and they're willing to be the go-between and say that it's a physician-run organization?
Honestly, the idea is so foreign to me. I wish we could pull it back, get it back in the box and make rules just like lawyers where healthcare organizations have to be owned by doctors. Can you imagine how much better the care would be? Because right now, doctors are being told to be a good doctor, they need to take 15 minutes, right? And there's such a conflict there. It's not fair for anyone. It's not fair for the patient. It's not fair for the doctor. Leah talks all the time about the medical profession's mental health going down because of the crazy things that they're being asked to do. And they're always made to feel guilty because they can't keep up with these ridiculous standards.
Yeah. Of what's considered the traditional professions, and most people will talk about architecture, engineering, law, and medicine, you'll find an architect and an engineer or a lawyer at the head of each of their organizations in which they practice their profession. And only 5 or 6% of the big healthcare systems are run by physicians, but they have better outcomes. It's only 5 or 6% of the healthcare systems across the United States, but it's 50% of the top 100 hospitals when they look at the US News and World Report's top 100 hospitals. And it's 75% of the elite groups, the best of the best, have physician CEOs. So the care is better, the quality is better, finances are better or the same, depending on which study you look at. So absolutely, it has been degraded. It seems very much to be profit motivated. Even in the not-for-profit systems, the CEOs in the not-for-profit systems are making salaries in the $7 million plus range. I think the Banner CEO made $21 million the last time that I saw that reported as an annual salary, annual income. They don't have people that can work in the lab or enough staff to handle the patient load, or they don't have the PPE that's needed, but their CEO is making bazillions of dollars. Well, thanks, Abbigail, for walking through some of that. I have spoken with healthcare attorneys. Their roles are often geared towards figuring out how to help people set up companies so that they stay out of trouble, establish contracts so that they're not overtly violating this state or that state's corporate practice of medicine laws. I haven't found a law firm involved in this for the purpose of protecting the profession of medicine. So if anybody listening knows of that person, I would love to interview somebody that's in a practice like that, where that's what they focus on.
Well, when my identity was stolen, I spent all day, every day for about 2 or 3 weeks looking for an attorney who would take my case. Doctors who are in trouble have limited financial resources. On the other hand, representing a hospital that has huge, enormous annual recurring revenues, who looks at a lawsuit where they lose a few $1 million as like cost of doing business. Mm-hmm. I looked into doing a key tam action at one point.
What's that?
Well, so if you think about it, when they were using my Medicare, Medicaid, PTAN numbers to bill patients that I never saw, that's Medicare, Medicaid fraud. Anybody ever sees any Medicare, Medicaid fraud, they can file a key tam action, which is a lawsuit. Mm-hmm. And if you win the lawsuit, then you get a certain portion. I think it's close to 50%. I don't know, Abbigail, am I saying this right?
What I know about that is that you're bringing action on behalf of the government, and you ask the government if you can do so. And then sometimes they allow you to go ahead, or sometimes they'll take it from you. and in which case you do get a portion of the settlement.
Right. And so the reason that we chose not to do a qui tam action is because I would have needed to not only prove that they were using my identity, but I would have needed to prove malicious intent, because there's a good chance that it was a mistake. It was a clerical error. It was a failure of their process to remove my name from the list or whatever. We didn't risk it. And we actually just reached a smaller settlement agreement around my lost wages during that time.
It's a David and Goliath kind of situation where the contracts are structured so that the physicians have very little power, or they have non-competes, so that if they wanted to take on the organization, they would end up having to leave their community, or they end up wanting to leave and they have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. It just feels like it's very much pitted against the physicians having an opportunity to make changes in the organization. They can be labeled as disruptive, removed, have a non-disclosure severance agreement, and then have to leave town.
Yeah, I call that a mafia contract.
Right.
If you look up #mafia contract, you might see a video that I did on it. In general, it's like, sign this mafia contract or you don't have a job. And what's really interesting is they often hire you, have you go through all this grueling administrative credentialing paperwork, 4 to 6 months. You're finding an apartment, you're signing a lease, you're doing the credentialing paperwork, and then boom, they slap you with an addendum to a contract right before you start, or a couple of weeks after you start, or they don't actually have the things that they promised you in the job interview in the first contract they send you, and they play games, they play tricks. And so that's why I call it a mafia contract, because then you're essentially signing something that you didn't originally agree to, because where else are you going to go? You're going to go find another job, do another job interview, wait another 4 to 6 months for credentialing. And then, no, I guess you'll just work in the place and sign the thing that they're forcing you to sign because you have no other choice. And that's why I believe that fixing the credentialing problem can fix the physician autonomy problem. Because if you can immediately prove your identity, prove your credentials, and be able to say, no, I'm not signing that. I'm going to go take a job around the corner down the street in another state because I can instantaneously pick that job up and start tomorrow. That is one way that we can capture our autonomy and regain control over the practice of medicine. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's just a perfect segue, Leah. So talk about what you're doing exactly and launch into it.
Well, so a lot of people are like, oh, we should start a union. And I looked into this. There is a couple of physicians unions. There's the Committee of Interns and Residents. There's a Union of American Physicians and Dentists, and they are actually physician union. The resident one is only for residents. The problem with unions is that, number one, they're centralized, meaning there's hierarchy, there's control. Number two, you have to get 51% of everybody in the organization to agree to the union guidelines. And they often have to also agree to having a portion of their paycheck taken out. Somewhere between 3 and 5% is traditionally what it is. And then you have to kind of hope that the union represents your interests. Yes, you get to vote, but are they going to actually do what you say? Kind of like the same thing as our specialty bodies. Are they actually serving our interests? Or are they serving their own interests? And so there's no direct democracy in unions. There's no direct democracy in our subspecialty boards. But through blockchain, through governance protocols that are cryptographically encoded, you can have direct democracy. And you can have what's called a decentralized autonomous organization, where individuals who participate in a network have an equal say in how the network is run, because the protocol is based on cryptography. And so there's no way to hack it, to spoof it. And that's what we built with HPEC.
I think we need to dive into HPEC, but I can't resist the opportunity to say one of the biggest problems with unions, from my perspective, is it's antithetical to what I think is the solution, which is physician leadership. If you're in a union, you are an employee. You are saying, I'm employed. I do not have power. I'm ceding my power to this larger group. And for me, that is the wrong direction. And I'm really interested, though, in hearing about HPEC. Can you bring it alive a little bit for us? It sounds very abstract.
Well, it's kind of like a digital physicians guild. Before we had the internet, before we had blockchain, before we had privacy preserving identity systems, we had to kind of go to the voting ballot and show up with our government issued ID and sign the paper and pull the ballot. And we had these hanging chads back in God knows when, and all these things that, come from these antiquated legacy systems that we previously had to use because the technology didn't exist to create any other opportunity for us. But through decentralized identity, through a decentralized autonomous organization where each individual on the network has a decentralized identity, where each of them has one opportunity to vote through this technologic tool where there's no risk of any of these legacy problems happening. And there's no need to have a representative democracy because the cryptography allows each individual to have power. And so that's essentially what we've built for doctors. We've built the digital guild, a decentralized autonomous organization, a digital identity. And with it, we have a wallet that can store your credentials, make you the primary owner of your credentials, make you able to be the primary source verification, meaning instead of having to go back to your medical school, your presentation of your diploma is received as just as accurate as a phone call from your school used to be, because proof of these events are on the blockchain that are immutable and permanent records of what actually happened.
And on the blockchain, they are accessible instantaneously. Is that right?
Accessible instantaneously. And the immutability is really what makes it powerful. The fact that you can't erase it.
Right.
So, the fact that you went to medical school, that's an event that can never be erased. Why are we not documenting that on a system that can't erase things? Why are we keeping all of that data in a centralized, what they call a student information system in this one medical school that now that one medical school has to maintain that database for the lifetime of the doctor's career? What if it gets hacked? What if it gets broken? What if there's a fire? What if there's a flood? It's just a cumbersome, antiquated way to do things when we have these new technologies.
And with the digital ledger, it's very hard to counterfeit. That is a new level of security, from what I understand. Is that right?
Well, it can't be counterfeited. I mean, because each block that you put on chain is dependent on the previous block's existence. So if you don't have the previous block's chains, then it's not able to be compared to these other distributed ledgers. Because when you let me take a step back.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So when you document something on a distributed ledger, let's use the Bitcoin blockchain for an example, because that's the most decentralized system that exists right now. When somebody makes a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain, it's instantaneously copied on thousands of computers. Okay. And the only way those copies are allowed to be made is if first they check all of those thousands of computers and there's the same record previously. So say, for example, there's a small group of people who try to say, you know what, let's try to lie and say that this $1 million is being transferred into my wallet. Well, unless there's more than 50% of these thousands of computers who are able to collude and do that, then people are going to notice that those transactions don't match all of these other transactions, and they will reject those transactions. And so the transactions that are placed on chain are hyper secure because people are making sure that they're matching all the other records. And so that's the distributed ledger mechanism. And then the immutability of it means that now these are the next transactions that are going to be checked next time another transaction comes on. So it continues, and that's why it's called a blockchain, because each block is added to the chain and is able to be recorded and reviewed to ensure that those transactions are real.
Can you bring it down to what would somebody do if they wanted to join in HPEC and be part of this? What does it look like in a real practical way?
Well, so we're trying to bridge this current centralized legacy paperwork world where we have a file of our PDF copies of our degrees or on our computer or on our wall. And we have these 4 to 6 months of having to go to this system and that system. And it's a big mess. So we're trying to bridge between that world that we're currently in and this future world where we have this streamlined, automated, cryptographically secure mechanism to instantaneously verify your credentials. So In order to bridge that gap, what we've decided to do is to create a wallet where you can store your paper credentials in one place using decentralized identity technology, creating a secure enclave where in that secure enclave, which is essentially your wallet that only you have the private keys to, you can then receive credentials from your medical school, from your residency, from your licensing program. And so the way we look at it is the first 1 to 10,000 doctors who use the system will probably only have their credentials, minus the pilot projects that we're in the process of working with. So we have one residency program that's actually going to use our system to issue residency certificates using the EverCred system into the HPEC wallets of the graduating class next year. And so we're going to have a few pilot projects using the verifiable credential system. But eventually, we're going to be able to build out those pilot projects and eventually work with states, work with medical schools, work with residency programs. And I have to say that this is, from a regulatory compliance perspective, they're moving in the direction of personal data ownership and personal data privacy. The American Association of Medical Colleges came out and said that they want decentralized identity to be the standard by 2023. They had their lecture back in September. And so essentially, they're saying that the technology that we've already built, they want that to be the standard. When you think about the 21st Century Cures Act, which I know some doctors out here have heard about it, they're pushing for patients to be the owners of their data.
Absolutely.
In my opinion, the only way for that to actually happen is if patients also have a decentralized identity. So we're building out the ecosystem by first giving physicians this tool of decentralized identity, a place to store their paper credentials, a place to receive their verifiable credentials when that's ready, which it's ready in some of these pilot projects, and we want to expand to more. And then also with these decentralized identity wallets, they have the ability to plug into decentralized health record systems and give patients their data and create the future decentralized healthcare ecosystem. And so without the doctors, in my opinion, first choosing to pick up this technology, choosing to move forward, to take back their autonomy, to take back their right to work, to move freely between health systems, to quit that job tomorrow so they can start another one the next day, or to quit a job altogether because they want to start their own private practice. This is the technology, this is the tool that will allow them to do that.
So let me see if I've got this. To start with, you'd actually be using this, the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, to collect really what is currently on paper record and be able to store that in the blockchain in a wallet. And over time, probably transform that into a digital record and also start incorporating original digital records without any paper involvement from the various certifying organizations and schools. You're looking forward to a time when this is how medical schools, residencies, state boards create the original records. It goes right into the blockchain.
So I'm looking forward to it because they've made it very clear that that is what they're planning to do. So they're planning to use this technology. And so if you're using decentralized identity standards and you're issuing verifiable credentials, you can issue them into the HPEC wallet, into your HPEC wallet. And I want to make it very clear, right now, I'm sure a lot of us have heard of CAQH, for example. CAQH is a place where they have a database. It's a web-based database. You can open up a profile. You can upload your credentials. A lot of health systems will ask you to use these systems. CAQH is not owned or controlled by you as an individual. CAQH is not decentralized. You cannot take your data anywhere. It is not owned by you. It is owned by them. And so that's in contrast to what we've built. When you onboard onto the HPEC application, you build your own secure enclave, your own decentralized identity space where you have your data, and you can take that and port it to any other decentralized identity system that uses these standards. So, you can go to Facebook tomorrow and download your data. I don't know, it might take 10 days, depending on how long you've been on Facebook. And you can take that data and do something with it, but it's not decentralized. It's not using these standards. It's not easily portable. That's the difference.
Right. And I've heard you use the term self-sovereign identity. So this is what you're referring to. It's owned by me. I've got control of it. So it's a SSI. which indicates that the owner of the credentials, she with the credentials, owns it and gives permission for it to be released or used.
Right. And so with the wallet today, when you share your paper credentials the same way that you do already, you can actually restrict and say, okay, I'm giving you access to these for X amount of time. And so if I had this system and I said, okay, I'm giving you this is a 1-year contract that I signed. You have my permission to use these for 1 year. If they use them after that time frame, it would have been very clear that they were breaking the law. It would have been much easier to fight that case. And it would have been much easier for me to negotiate my next contract because I've revoked my credentials until we have another discussion about what the next contract is going to be. So it puts a lot more power into the hands of the individual doctor. You also you're allowed entrance into private groups of other credentialed physicians. So if you have a state license in New York, you will be auto-entered into a group of licensed physicians in the state of New York. If you have a residency certificate from internal medicine, you will be entered into a group of other internal medicine physicians. You can connect with your colleagues from other specialties, other states. And when you make those connections, you essentially are building your own referral network that you own and you control. So rather than these large vertically integrated insurance companies, we now can build our own referral networks. And so once we have our own credentials, once we have a right to be the primary source of those credentials, once we have a way to communicate and to govern ourselves easily in a streamlined way that's fair and equitable amongst all physicians, once we have a way to build our own referral networks, once we have a way to document on decentralized health record systems and transfer that data directly to our patients, what do we need the third parties for?
Right. What's the big picture? What are you hoping for long term?
I'm hoping that that my fellow colleagues are able to do what they set out to do when they applied to medical school. I went through the whole process of medical school and residency, and I was devastated that I was being forced to practice in this corrupt system. We these malaligned incentives where I was basically being pressured to practice assembly line medicine, where I was being told to practice unethical medicine, essentially, not directly. They're very insidious about it. I'm trying to build an opportunity for us to have our freedom to practice again, to have our autonomy to practice again, and to untether the patients from these systems as well. The patients are very frustrated with us. They're blaming us because they think we're in control. They don't realize that we're not. They don't realize the physician community has no say and that we are also being abused and harmed by the system. So it's time for us to stop pretending like the system is going to take care of us and start realizing that we need to stand up and adopt new technologies that are going to help us and help our patients and stop participating in systems that are destructive to our practice. And this is a tool. The way I look at it, it's a lifeline. It's a tool that if the physician community chooses to pick it up, chooses to adopt it, chooses to build the future of healthcare, they say that we don't like technology. They say that we don't know how to use technology. They say that we don't know what we're doing. They blame us for the HR nonsense. Well, this is our chance to prove them wrong. And so I hope that everybody decides to, because I don't know what's going to happen if we don't. It's really scary out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And it sounds like it's very much a patient advocacy move to make. Really one of the best things that we could do to transform our work lives, but also to be able to serve patients independently. So tell me where people can find you, Leah and Abbigail.
Well, I'm on Twitter, Leah Houston, MD, HPEC ID for HPEC. You can go to our website. If you are a physician and you want access to this, we are currently giving out early access passes to our earliest followers and our earliest investors. Mm-hmm. We raised money from doctors on a crowdfund to build this. So this is a completely decentralized system. Even the ownership is decentralized and owned collectively by the physician community. And so sign up on our website to get your access pass and join us. Let's fix this together.
Excellent. Abbigail, where can people find you?
It's Abbigail Webb, and they can find me on the Florida Bar. Thank you so much, Patty, for having me. And I'm very excited about your project, Leah. I think it's much needed in the medical community.
Hear, hear. I agree. Thank you both for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. It's a really important story to tell, the difference between attorneys and physicians. And I'm really grateful that you're allowing us to tell it.
Super. It sounds like you're creating the future and we need to support you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patty.
Thanks a bunch. I really enjoyed learning about all this.
Take care.
Thanks again to Abbigail Webb and Leah Houston. If this week's topic took you into unknown territory the way it did me, check out our newsletter and show notes for definitions of various acronyms, everything from HPEC to SSI. I'll also do deeper dives into other topics that were discussed, from qui tam actions to distributed autonomous organizations. I sure appreciate you listening to the License to Lead podcast. And as always, thank you for all of your care and caring.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.